The Duke of Alastair considered his wife. He did so in the same manner he might consider a new acquisition of land or a promising thoroughbred for his stables, with a cool, dispassionate eye for utility. She sat across the cavernous dining hall, a small, still figure dwarfed by the baronial splendor of Alastair House. Her name was Eleanor, and she was now his duchess. The arrangement had been neat, efficient, and entirely devoid of sentiment, which suited him perfectly. Her father, a baron with a dusty lineage and an even dustier library, had possessed a name, but no fortune. Alastair possessed a fortune, or what was left of it, and a title in desperate need of a legitimate heir. Debts were settled, a contract was signed, and Miss Eleanor Vance had been delivered to his doorstep like a piece of well-packaged, high-quality furniture. She was not a beauty. There was no denying that. Her features were pleasant enough, arranged in a composition of quiet intelligence, but they did not sing. They did not command a room upon entry. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves after the fire had gone out of them, a muted brown that absorbed the candlelight rather than reflecting it. She was, he had concluded, entirely suitable, unremarkable. She would not cause scenes, harbor scandalous ambitions, or run up ruinous bills at the modiste. She would be a quiet presence, a placid vessel for the continuation of his line. He had heard about her education. Her father, it was said, had treated her more as a pupil than a daughter, filling her head with mathematics, philosophy, and agricultural science. A strange and largely useless curriculum for a woman destined for the marriage market. Alastair had dismissed it with a private, internal scoff. What use had a duchess for knowing the principles of crop rotation or the theories of Adam Smith? Her sphere was the drawing room, the nursery, the management of household staff. He had mentioned as much to his friend, Lord Harrington, over a bottle of port at his club only a month prior. Her education was wasted on her, he had pronounced, with the unthinking arrogance of a man who had never had his own pronouncements questioned. Harrington had laughed in agreement. It was the consensus of their world. Now, watching her, he felt a flicker of that same certainty. She ate with a neat, precise economy of movement, her eyes cast down. She had spoken little since her arrival, answering his queries with a polite brevity that bordered on silence. He found it restful. The society women of his acquaintance chattered like agitated magpies, their conversation a tiresome tapestry of gossip and thinly veiled ambition. Eleanor's silence was a balm. It was the silence of a well-ordered room, the quiet hum of a machine operating as it should. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the echoing space. "Is the venison to your liking, Your Grace?" She looked up, and for a moment, her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of gray like a winter sky, met his. There was an unnerving stillness in her gaze, an observant quality that made him feel, for a fleeting second, like the one being assessed. "It is excellent, Your Grace. The cook has a deft hand with the juniper." It was a simple, correct observation. Yet, the precision of the phrase, "a deft hand with the juniper," was unexpected. It was not the vague compliment he had anticipated. It was analytical. He grunted a non-committal response and returned to his meal. The house was settling around them, groaning under the weight of centuries. It was a magnificent, decaying beast, this ancestral home of his. The roof leaked in the east wing. Dry rot was creeping into the library's foundations, and the estate ledgers were a Gordian knot of debt, mismanagement, and neglect left by his profligate father. That was his sphere, the hard, masculine world of finance and repair. He would wrestle the beast into submission. His duchess, in the meantime, would attend to the linens and the seating arrangements. The division of labor was clear, ancient, and correct. He finished his wine, the thought solidifying into comfortable conviction. Her education was indeed a waste. It was a charming, useless eccentricity, like a ship built in a bottle. A clever thing to behold, but it could not sail. Eleanor moved through the first weeks of her marriage as if navigating a foreign country whose language she understood but chose not to speak. Allister House was not a home. It was a principality. Its corridors were long, cold avenues, its rooms vast, echoing territories. Dust motes danced like frantic sprites in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating the faded grandeur of tapestries and the tarnished gleam of silver. She saw everything. She saw the worn thread on the Aubusson carpet in the gallery, the faint watermark of a persistent leak staining the silk wallpaper behind a portrait of a grim-faced ancestor, the subtle tremor in the butler's hand that suggested an overfondness for the ducal cellars. She saw the chaos that her husband papered over with his formidable, aristocratic composure. He was a man who believed in command, not management. He issued orders, expecting the world to bend to his will. But the world of Allister House was old and stubborn. It was a world of entropy, of slow, inexorable decay that could not be halted by a sharp command. It required something else. It required system. It required understanding. It required precisely the kind of thinking her father had spent 18 years instilling in her. Her husband, the Duke, was a stranger to her. He was polite, correct, and distant. He treated her with the careful courtesy one might afford a valuable but unfamiliar object. They dined together each evening, the length of the polished mahogany table, a vast, unbridgeable distance between them. He would ask about her day. She would give him a brief, edited summary. She had spoken with the housekeeper, she had walked in the gardens, she had read in the library. She did not tell him that her conversation with the housekeeper had been a gentle, systematic interrogation of the household accounts, revealing a system of procurement so inefficient it was practically an act of self-sabotage. She did not tell him that her walk in the gardens had been a careful survey of the neglected greenhouses and fallow kitchen plots, her mind calculating yields and soil deficiencies. She did not tell him that her reading in the library had not been of novels, but of the dusty estate maps and agricultural journals she had found, tucked away in a forgotten corner. One evening, he made an effort. "Your father was a great scholar," he said, his voice echoing slightly. "I presume you share his love of books." "I do," she replied. "Poetry, perhaps. The ladies are fond of Byron." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "I confess I have always preferred treatises on land enclosure and studies of crop rotation. Mr. Arthur Young is a particular favorite." Allister stared at her. For a moment, his mask of ducal indifference slipped. He looked utterly baffled, as if she had just confessed to a passion for breeding newts. "Arthur Young?" he repeated, the name foreign on his tongue. "His Annals of Agriculture contains some most illuminating passages on soil improvement," she said, her voice even. He recovered quickly, masking his surprise with a dry chuckle. "A peculiar interest for a duchess." He said it as if it were a final judgment, a neat closing of a conversational box he had no desire to reopen. The topic was dropped. He had been offered a glimpse into her mind, and he had found it alien, irrelevant. He had recalibrated his assessment of her from unremarkable to unremarkably odd. It did not occur to him that her peculiar interest might be of any practical value. It did not occur to him to ask another question. The silence that followed felt different. It was heavier, freighted with his dismissal. Eleanor registered it, filed it away. She was a woman accustomed to being underestimated. She had learned long ago that the world had little patience for a clever woman, and so she had cultivated a quiet exterior. It was a form of armor. She had assumed, or perhaps hoped, that her husband might be different, that the man who now owned her person might be curious about the contents of her mind. That hope, small and tentative as it was, began to wither. A few days later, she found the letter. She had taken it upon herself to bring some semblance of order to his study, a room that looked as if a hurricane of paper had recently passed through. Bills, invitations, reports, and correspondence were piled in precarious drifts on every available surface. It was a task she had assigned herself, a way to feel useful, to impose a small pocket of logic onto the chaos of her new life. The letter was on his desk, lying open near the inkwell. It was from Lord Harrington, its familiar, florid script easy to read. Her eyes scanned the page, initially without intent, simply as another item to be sorted. Then a phrase snagged her attention. "Your new Duchess seems a quiet sort. As you said at the club, she is well-bred enough, I suppose, but all that book learning, a complete waste. Her father's education was wasted on her. A duchess needs to produce an heir, not balance a budget." Eleanor froze. The air in the room grew thin and cold. The words were not a blow. They were a key turning in a lock. They did not wound her so much as they clarified everything. His distance, his polite incomprehension, his dismissal of her interests. It was not mere indifference. It was a settled, articulated opinion, a judgment delivered to his friends over wine, wasted on her. She stood perfectly still for a full minute, the letter in her hand. There was no surge of tears, no hot flush of anger. Instead, a profound, chilling calm settled over her. It was the calm of a general seeing the battlefield laid out with perfect, terrible clarity. He had married her for her womb and her name. The rest of her, the mind her father had so lovingly cultivated, the knowledge she had so diligently acquired, was considered decorative surplus, useless. Very carefully, with fingers that did not tremble, she folded the letter back along its original creases. She placed it precisely where she had found it. She looked around the chaotic study, at the mountains of paper that represented a dukedom in disarray. A duchess needs to produce an heir, not balance a budget. A quiet, dangerous thought took root in the fertile soil of her mind. Perhaps, she thought, a duchess might do both. Or perhaps she might just do the one thing he believed her incapable of, and let the other wait. A door had closed. Not a door in the grand, drafty house, but a door deep inside her. The part of her that had hoped for a partner, for a meeting of minds, was now shuttered. In its place, something else was being built, something methodical, precise, and entirely her own. She would take her wasted education and she would apply it. She would bring order to his chaos. She would save his crumbling inheritance from the shadows with the quiet, invisible efficiency of a ghost. He would have his well-run estate. He would have his placid, unremarkable wife, and he would never, ever know the two were one and the same. The change in the Duchess of Alastair was so subtle as to be almost imperceptible. To her husband, she remained the same quiet, placid figure who presided over his dinner table. Her conversation remained brief, her demeanor serene. He was, if he had thought about it, quite satisfied. She ran the household with an efficiency that was beginning to border on miraculous. Meals appeared on time. The staff, once a squabbling, disorganized cohort, moved with a new, quiet purpose. The perpetual film of dust that had coated Alistair House seemed to be in retreat. He credited it to her simply being a woman. He assumed this was their natural state of being, an instinct for domestic order that his bachelor household had lacked. He did not look any deeper. He was a man consumed by larger problems. The reports from his estate manager, Mr. Fletcher, were a litany of woes. Tenant farmers threatening to leave over blighted crops, rents in arrears, the looming cost of repairing the North Bridge, which was on the verge of collapse. Each morning, Alistair would sit in his study, the sea of paperwork threatening to drown him, and feel a familiar spike of helpless frustration. He was the Duke. He was supposed to command this chaos into submission. But the chaos was insidious, 1,000 small leaks rather than a single great flood. He failed to notice the new book that appeared on Mr. Fletcher's desk in the estate office, a plain, leather-bound volume with no title. He failed to notice the unsigned notes that began to appear with it, written in a fine, clear, feminine hand. The first note was simple, attached to the quarterly report on the dairy farm. It suggested, with detailed calculations, that changing the herd's winter fodder from low-grade hay to a mixture including turnips and clover, as outlined in a recent agricultural journal, would increase milk yields by an estimated 15%, more than offsetting the initial cost. Fletcher, a man old enough to have seen two dukes run the estate into the ground, read the note with astonishment. He read it twice. The proposal was radical, but the logic was impeccable. He was a man drowning in problems, and here was a life raft. On a whim, he implemented the change. 2 months later, milk yields were up by 18%. More notes followed. A suggestion for a new system of bookkeeping, based on double-entry methods, that would make tracking expenses and income transparent and immediate. A detailed plan for reorganizing the tenancies, consolidating smaller, inefficient plots, and offering incentives for farmers to adopt new crop rotation schedules. A meticulously researched proposal for sourcing timber for the North Bridge from their own neglected woodlands rather than paying an exorbitant price to an outside merchant, complete with calculations on labor costs and seasoning times. Each suggestion was anonymous, logical, and transformative. Mr. Fletcher began to think of his unseen benefactor as the ghost. The ghost was brilliant. The ghost was saving them. He had his suspicions about the ghost's identity. He had noticed the new Duchess's quiet, observant eyes. He had seen her in the library, poring over the very same agricultural journals from which these revolutionary ideas seemed to spring. But he was a wise man, and he kept his suspicions to himself. He simply implemented the plans and presented the miraculously improving results to the Duke. Alistair was pleased, but also vaguely puzzled. "Fletcher," he said one morning, looking over a report that showed, for the first time in a decade, a small quarterly profit. "You seem to have found a new spring in your step. This is excellent work." "I have had a fresh perspective, Your Grace," the old manager said, his face a mask of careful neutrality. Alistair accepted the explanation. It was easier than examining the miracle too closely. He was a man who preferred results to processes. The estate was improving, and that was all that mattered. The pressure on him began to ease. He found he had more time, more mental space. And in that new space, he began to notice other things. He began to notice his wife's absence. It was a strange thing to notice, for she was always physically present. She was there at breakfast, at dinner, in the drawing room in the evenings. She was a fixed point in his daily orbit. But she was not there. Her smiles were polite, but they did not reach her clear, gray eyes. Her conversation was correct, but it offered nothing of herself. He realized, with a sudden jolt, that he knew nothing about the woman he had married. He knew her name, her lineage, her suitability. He did not know what made her laugh, what she feared, or what she thought about when she sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap. He started watching her. He saw her walking in the gardens, her head bent in thought. He saw the light under her study door burning late into the night. He once asked her what she was doing. "Organizing my correspondence, Your Grace," she had replied, her voice smooth and unrevealing. He saw how the staff deferred to her, not with the fearful obedience they showed him, but with a deep, quiet respect. The formidable housekeeper, a woman who had terrified him as a child, was heard asking the Duchess's opinion on the rehiring of a kitchen maid. The house was running perfectly. The estate was healing itself. His life was, by all external measures, improving dramatically. And yet, he felt a growing sense of unease. The silence in the house was no longer restful. It felt empty. The perfect order felt sterile. He had a suitable, efficient duchess who ran his home like a Swiss watch. But he did not have a wife. He had a ghost in his own house. One evening, he tried to breach the wall. "The reports from the estate are much improved," he offered, hoping to draw her into a conversation. "I am pleased to hear it, Your Grace," she said, her eyes on her plate. "Fletcher seems to have had a stroke of genius. Mr. Fletcher is a very capable man." Her replies were impenetrable. They were smooth, polished stones that gave him no purchase. He felt a frustration that was entirely new to him. He was the Duke of Allister. He was used to commanding, to questioning, to receiving answers, but he did not know how to speak to his own wife. He did not know the language. He had never thought to learn it. The accumulation of clues began. Small, disconnected observations that started to form a disturbing pattern in his mind. He saw a copy of Arthur Young's Annals of Agriculture on a table in the hall, a book he vaguely remembered her mentioning. He overheard two grooms discussing the new drainage plan for the water meadows, a plan he had never approved. He saw his wife's hand resting on the tablecloth and noticed a faint smudge of ink on her forefinger, the ink of a clerk or a scholar, not a duchess. Each clue was a pinprick, insignificant on its own, but together they began to create a profound and unsettling itch in his consciousness. A story was being written in his house, a story in which he was not the main character. The protagonist was a ghost, and the ghost was beginning to look remarkably like his quiet, unremarkable wife. The thought was so absurd, so contrary to the entire structure of his world, that he dismissed it, and then dismissed it again. But it kept returning, persistent and troubling, like a melody he could not place. He was a man who prided himself on logic, and the logic was leading him to an impossible conclusion. The moment of revelation, when it came, was not a lightning strike, but a slow, dawning horror. It began with Mr. Fletcher. Allister, his unease finally coalescing into active suspicion, had summoned the estate manager to his study. He wanted answers. "The turnaround on the tenant farms is remarkable, Fletcher," the Duke began, his tone deceptively casual. "The new crop rotation system. Whose idea was it?" Mr. Fletcher, who had been dreading this conversation for months, shifted his weight. It was an idea that presented itself, Your Grace, a modern approach. Indeed, a modern approach that appeared on your desk in the form of an anonymous note, I'd wager. Alistair's eyes were sharp. Show me the notes. The old manager hesitated. His loyalty was torn. He owed his position to the Duke, but he owed the salvation of the estate to the Duchess. In the end, his respect for competence won out over his adherence to protocol. He retrieved a small, locked box, and from it, he produced a sheaf of papers. He laid them on the Duke's desk. Alistair looked down. He saw pages of dense, elegant script filled with figures, projections, and citations from learned journals. He saw his entire dukedom, dissected and analyzed with the precision of a master surgeon. He saw solutions to problems that had plagued him for years, laid out with breathtaking clarity and logic. The handwriting was neat, feminine, and vaguely familiar. He had seen it before, on household notes, on place cards. His heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. "Who wrote these?" he demanded, though he already knew the answer. "I am not at liberty to say, Your Grace," Fletcher said quietly. But Alistair was no longer listening. He was staring at the handwriting, and his mind was racing, connecting the ink smudge on his wife's finger, the late-night lamp in her study, her strange comment about Arthur Young. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the very floor of his world had tilted on its axis. He dismissed Fletcher with a wave of his hand and sat there, alone, the pages spread before him like an indictment. That night, he waited until the house was asleep. A terrible, urgent need for certainty drove him. He walked silently down the corridor to his wife's study. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was a revelation. It was not the feminine space he had imagined. It was a command center. Maps of the estate were pinned to one wall, marked with colored threads. Books on engineering, economics, and agriculture were stacked on the tables. And on her desk, open and illuminated by a single candle, was a ledger. It was a perfect mirror of his own chaotic estate ledger, but this one was balanced. Every expense was accounted for, every income projected. It was a work of genius. It was the work of months, perhaps years, of silent, tireless effort. He stood in the center of the room, stunned into absolute stillness. This was the source of the miracle. This was the ghost. He felt a wave of awe, so profound it was almost painful. And then, as he opened a drawer in her desk, searching for, he knew not what, he saw it. A single letter, folded neatly. He recognized the florid script of Lord Harrington. He picked it up. His hands were trembling. He unfolded it and read the words he himself had spoken. The careless, cruel pronouncement made in the smoky comfort of his club. Her father's education was wasted on her. A duchess needs to produce an heir, not balance a budget. The air left his lungs in a rush. It all crashed down upon him then, the full, crushing weight of his own monumental, catastrophic foolishness. He saw it all, her discovery of his words, her silent, dignified retreat, her decision not to confront him, not to rage, but to answer his insult with an act of quiet, astonishing brilliance. She had taken his scorn and used it as fuel. She had taken the education he had dismissed as a waste and used it to save him. He thought about her silence, which he had mistaken for placidity. It was not placidity. It was purpose. He thought about her presence, which he had found unremarkable. It was not unremarkable. It was a veil, behind which a formidable mind was constantly at work. He thought about his own blindness, his arrogance, his utter failure to see the woman who stood right in front of him. He had looked at a priceless jewel and seen only a common stone. He sank into her chair, the letter clutched in his fist. He was the Duke of Alistair, a man of power and privilege, a man who had been given everything. And in that moment, he had never felt so small, so utterly and despicably unworthy. The silence of the house pressed in on him, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the magnitude of his error. He had not just misjudged his wife. He had failed her in a way that felt fundamental, a sin of perception so profound it bordered on the blasphemous. He had not seen her. He had not seen her at all. He did not seek her out immediately. The shame was a physical weight, a sickness in his gut. He spent the remainder of the night in her study, surrounded by the evidence of her mind, a mind he had so casually maligned. He read her notes, traced the lines on her maps, ran his fingers over the neat columns of her ledgers. It was an act of penance, an immersion in the truth of who she was. By the time the gray light of dawn crept through the window, a new resolve had hardened within him. Apologies were insufficient. Words were cheap. The insult had been public in its way, spoken to his peers. The atonement would have to be as well. But first, he had to face her. He found her in the conservatory. It was a vast, neglected structure of iron and glass at the back of the house, a place of forgotten, dying plants. In recent weeks, she had begun to tend to it. He found her there, her hands gloved, carefully pruning a frost-bitten rosebush. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and new life. She looked up as he entered, her expression calm, unreadable. For the first time, he saw the faint lines of fatigue around her eyes, and his guilt twisted deeper. He walked towards her, stopping a few feet away. He held out the letter from Lord Harrington. "I found this," he said, his voice hoarse, "in your desk." Eleanor looked at the letter, then back at his face. She did not feign surprise. She simply waited. "I have seen your work," he continued, his gaze sweeping around the conservatory, a symbol of the larger restoration she was undertaking. The ledgers, the plans, everything. He took a breath, forcing himself to meet her clear, steady gaze. "I was wrong." The words, simple as they were, felt momentous. They were an admission of a failure so complete it beggared belief. I was a fool, an arrogant, blind fool. He did not ask for her forgiveness. He felt he had no right to it. He was not there to beg, but to confess, to state the truth as he now, finally, understood it. The things you know, the way your mind works, it is not a waste. It is a gift I was too stupid to see. He watched her face, searching for any flicker of emotion, any crack in her serene composure. There was nothing. She merely inclined her head, a small, regal gesture of acknowledgement. "Thank you for your honesty, Your Grace," she said, and her voice was as cool and clear as the morning air. Then she turned back to her rosebush and made a neat, precise cut with her shears. The finality of the gesture was absolute. He had confessed. He had not been absolved. He stood there for another moment, feeling like a supplicant dismissed from the throne, then turned and walked away. He knew what he had to do next. That afternoon, Alistair drove his carriage into London and went directly to his club. He found Lord Harrington holding court by the fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand. Alistair walked directly to him, his presence commanding the attention of the room. "Harrington," he said, his voice low but carrying in the sudden quiet. "I need a word with you." Harrington smiled, oblivious. "Alistair, good to see you. Come, Have a drink." "No," Alistair said. "I am here to correct a statement I made in your presence some months ago. A statement you have seen fit to repeat." The smile on Harrington's face faltered. The other men in the room leaned in, sensing drama. "I once told you," Alistair announced, his voice ringing with conviction, "that my wife's education was wasted on her. I am here today, before all of you, to state that this was the single most ignorant and baseless pronouncement of my entire life." A collective murmur went through the room. Harrington's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "The Duchess's education," Alistair continued, his eyes locked on his friend's, "is not a liability. It is the single greatest asset to my name and my estate. Her intelligence and her knowledge have accomplished in 6 months what I and my managers failed to accomplish in 5 years. She is not merely my wife. She is the architect of my family's future prosperity. Any man who suggests otherwise is a fool, and any man who repeats my former, foolish opinion will have me to answer to." He let the words hang in the stunned silence. He had publicly humiliated himself, retracting his own arrogant boast. He had championed his wife's intellect in the most masculine of spaces. He had drawn a line in the sand. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and strode out of the club, leaving a scene of utter consternation in his wake. The drive back to Alistair House was long. He had done what he had to do, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the true work had only just begun. The public declaration was easy. Earning back the trust of the woman he had so grievously wronged would be infinitely harder. Eleanor heard of the incident at the club within 2 days. News of that nature traveled faster than a royal courier. Her aunt, a woman with an impeccable network of informants, sent her a letter detailing the entire exchange with breathless admiration. Eleanor read the letter, and for the first time since she had found Harrington's note, she felt something other than cold resolve. It was a flicker of warmth, faint and surprising. His public atonement was more than she had expected. It was a decisive, unambiguous act. It was proof that his confession to her in the conservatory had not been a momentary pang of guilt, but a fundamental shift in his understanding. Yet she did not yield. Trust, once shattered, could not be pieced back together with a single grand gesture. It had to be rebuilt, slowly, brick by painful brick. When he returned from London, she was polite, as she had always been. She acknowledged his action with a quiet, "I heard what you did, Your Grace." It was a brave thing to do. But she offered no more. The door that had closed within her remained shut, if not, perhaps, bolted. Alistair understood. He did not press her. He began a new campaign, a quiet, patient siege upon the fortress of her reserve. He started by treating her not as a wife, but as the partner he had belatedly realized she was. He brought the real estate ledgers to her study, not the copies she had painstakingly made, but the originals. He laid them on her desk. "I cannot make sense of the forestry accounts," he said, without preamble. "I would be grateful for your perspective." It was the first time he had ever asked for her help. It was the first time he had admitted a weakness to her. She looked at him, her gray eyes searching his, and then she nodded. "Leave them with me." That night, they sat in her study, their heads bent over the same ledger under the lamplight. For the first time, they were not separated by the vast expanse of the dining table. They were collaborators. He watched her fingers trace the columns of figures, listened as she spoke of timber yields and milling costs. Her voice, usually so quiet, took on a new energy, a new confidence when she spoke of these things. He found himself utterly captivated. He was not just seeing her intelligence, he was experiencing it. He was learning its language. This became their new ritual. Every evening, they would work together. He brought her every problem, every decision. He learned to listen, truly listen, to her careful, well-reasoned arguments. He discovered that beneath her quiet exterior lay a dry, sharp wit that emerged in unguarded moments, making him laugh in surprise. He learned that her quietness was not an absence of opinion, but a careful consideration before speaking. He started to notice the small things, the details of her person that his earlier blindness had obscured. He noticed the way a stray curl escaped her tightly pinned hair when she was concentrating. He noticed that her eyes, which he had thought were simply gray, held flecks of green and silver that caught the light. He noticed she had a particular fondness for the scent of lavender, and that she hummed, very softly, when she was content. He was courting his own wife, discovering her piece by piece, as if she were a new and fascinating country. The rebuilding was a slow, quiet process, marked not by grand declarations but by small, consistent acts of respect. He began to bring her tea in her study when she worked late. He sought out a rare book on Italian Renaissance gardens he had heard her mention, and left it for her as a gift. When a neighboring landowner visited and made a condescending remark about bluestockings, Alistair shut him down with a cold finality that made the man turn pale. He was becoming her champion, not just in public, but in the small, private moments that constituted a life. A financial crisis, inherited from his father's disastrous speculations, provided the ultimate test of their new partnership. A major loan was called in, threatening the solvency of the entire estate. Panic seized Alistair. His first instinct was to command, to fight, to ride to London and confront the bankers. His new instinct, hard-won over the preceding months, was to go to his wife. He laid the demand letter on her desk. "We are on the verge of ruin," he said, the words tasting like ash. Eleanor read the letter, her face calm. She did not panic. She picked up a pencil. "Ruin is an emotional term," she said, her voice steady. "Let us deal with the numbers." For 3 days and nights, they worked without stopping. They pored over every asset, every account. She was relentless, her mind a sharp, brilliant instrument, cutting through the dense fog of his fear. She found assets he had forgotten, identified revenue streams he had overlooked. She drafted a counter-proposal to the bankers, a complex, audacious plan of restructuring that was both a plea for time and a staggering display of financial acumen. They traveled to London together to present it. In the intimidating boardroom of the bank, Alistair began to speak, but the bankers directed their questions to him, their eyes sliding past Eleanor as if she were a piece of furniture. After a moment, Alistair stopped. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice firm, "you are addressing your questions to the wrong person. The Duchess is the author of this plan. She is the master of these figures. I am merely her associate in this matter." The bankers stared, astounded, but Alistair turned to Eleanor and nodded. She met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw something new, a warmth, a flicker of the trust he had been working so hard to regain. She then turned to the board of directors and began to speak. She laid out their proposal with a clarity and confidence that left the room of powerful men silent, and then, slowly, deeply impressed. They walked out of that bank with the agreement they needed. They had saved the dukedom together. On the carriage ride home, a comfortable silence settled between them. The crisis had been averted, Their partnership had been forged in the crucible of that shared fight. "My associate?" she said finally, a smile playing on her lips. "I thought it was more accurate than the woman who is single-handedly rescuing me from my own family's incompetence," he replied, his own mouth curving into a smile. She laughed. It was a real, unguarded sound, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. "Alistair," she said, her voice softer now, her use of his given name a quiet intimacy. "The door is open." He knew exactly what she meant. He reached across the carriage and took her hand. Her fingers, no longer ink-stained, curled around his. It was not an ending. It was a beginning. A year later, the Duke of Alistair stood in the fully restored conservatory. Sunlight streamed through the polished glass panes, illuminating a lush, thriving world of green. Orchids bloomed in vibrant bursts of color, and the air was sweet with the scent of jasmine and damp earth. The sound of laughter drew his attention. Eleanor was standing by a fountain with Sir Joseph Banks, the famed botanist, engaged in a vigorous, animated debate about the classification of a new species of fern from Australia. His wife, his Duchess, was radiant. Her face was alive with intelligence and passion. She was no longer a quiet, still figure in the shadows of his house. She was its vibrant, beating heart. Their life was a true partnership, a constant conversation of minds and hearts. The estate was flourishing, a model of modern agricultural practice. The staff was loyal and happy. The house, once a decaying monument to past glories, felt like a home, filled with warmth and light. Eleanor, seeing him, excused herself from Sir Joseph and walked over to him, her hand sliding easily into his. "Was I being too argumentative?" she asked, a teasing glint in her silver-green eyes. "You were being brilliant," he said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. He drew her closer, his hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach, where their child, a new life born not of duty, but of a deep and abiding love, now grew. "You are always brilliant." He thought back to that man he had been, the arrogant Duke in his London club, so certain in his pronouncements, so blind in his perceptions. He had believed her education was wasted. How little he had known. His own education had taught him how to inherit a title, how to give a command, how to maintain a brittle facade of power. Hers had taught her something infinitely more valuable. It had taught her how to see a problem, how to analyze it, and how to build a solution. His education was about holding on. Hers was about creating. He watched her as she turned her face up to the sun, a picture of serene, confident happiness. He had almost wasted her. The greatest asset he had ever possessed, he had nearly discarded out of sheer, unthinking ignorance. But now he saw. He finally, truly saw. And he knew he would spend the rest of his life making sure she knew she was seen, and that she was, and always would be, cherished.